Hello and welcome to my paper, Gothic Hauntings and Uncanny Resurfacings in Sarah Moss's Neo-Victorian Gothic trilogy. In Night Waking, published in 2011, the first book of the trilogy, historian Anna Bennet, finding herself in that particular moment of uncanny returns that is the presentation in an academic interview, realizes that, and I quote, "There is nothing that has more impact on the terrors of the next generation than the way we tell stories of the past." Indeed, when family history, folk stories, island gossip, and superstitions all cluster around the discovery of a Victorian baby skeleton and a collection of letters from the same period, Anna and her family will find themselves on a Gothic shore haunted by a neo-Victorian textual and material ghosts. An early career scholar at an Oxford college, married to a biology professor of aristocratic origins, Giles Cassingham, Anna Bennet struggles to complete her first monograph while being the primary caregiver of her two small boys, a situation that many academics, regardless of their gender and family situation, can no doubt sympathize with given the current pandemic. In fact, it is while planting trees with her sons during a long stay on her husband's family island, Colsay, which is based on St Kilda in the Outer Hebrides, that her 7-year-old son, Raph, hits the small skull that marks the extraordinary find. A quick DNA search reveals that the dead baby, a girl who died weeks after her birth in the 1870s, and was buried in the Cassingham's garden, is uncannily her husband's ancestor, as well as a material revenant of infant mortality in centuries past, representing the tragic appearance of a life and a destiny frozen in time, as well as a return of a material presence that has obviously blood and genetic components in common with the Cassingham family. Indeed, Raph, the 7-year-old, experiences significant distress upon finding the dead skull, to the point where he starts, and I quote, "thinking about death, nothing like being dead," end of quote, and starts feeling a presence in the house's attic, which he conflates with the baby's ghost returning to haunt more young Cassinghams. In typical Gothic fashion, the noise is eventually located as caused by a trapped bird, which dies in the attic by suffocation, representing a repulsive counterpoint and a further memento mori to the baby found in the ground. And we also have the two Gothic locales par excellence here, the ground, obviously the burial ground, and the attic as that place of mystery and secrets coming out, which are due to come out. The baby, which Anna and her family poignantly call Eve, is later discovered to have also been the result of an extramarital affair between a Cassingham and a poor Islander in the 1870s, and particularly in 1878. At the peak of the decade of extraordinarily high child mortality on the island, probably due to the poor sanitary conditions in which the instruments used by the local midwife to cut the umbilical cord were kept. Events which led to the Cassingham patriarch of the time, who was basically the owner and landlord of the island, to invite a Mancunian nurse, May Moberley, to move to the island in an attempt to reduce the tragic rate and to introduce more modern antenatal care to childbearing women. If the skeleton is the material appearance of Eve's tragic story, May crucially provides a textual link across the two periods through the discovery of her letters from the island in Anna's attic. Crucially, the letters have remained in the place where they were written, so they never reached their destination. And May's story, although quite let's say secondary to the plot of Night Waking, is actually explored in greater detail in the two subsequent books of Moss's Neo-Victorian Gothic trilogy, Bodies of Light and Science for Lost Children, where May and her sister Alethea, or Ali, are the protagonists, in particular in Bodies of Light. In Victorian Hauntings, Julian Wolfrays maintains that haunting is, and I quote, "repetition with a difference. Haunting as the immaterial projection of the other is the discernible material trace, and the way in which the spectrum is perceived, the ways in which we receive the phantom, indeed if we receive it at all, is a sign of historical intervention." Indeed, if the skeleton of little Eve disrupts the contemporary Cassing and Bennet's routine with its distressing presence and the layers of hereditary legacies that it embodies, the blood, the genes, the haunting, the ghost, it is also an uncanny anticipation or repetition of Anna and Giles's children, with the difference, of course, primarily the difference of gender, but also the difference that while Anna and Giles's children are alive and healthy thanks to a universal healthcare system free of the point of views, Eve died as a result of the limited care that was given to her and her mother as a result of philanthropy. But also to signify that the children are not immune to the cumbersome presence of the past in their lives, as Raff's obsession with the ghost proves. Equally, while Anna's privileged position as an emancipating 21st century woman with a doctorate is in no way comparable to that of a poor rural woman in love with or potentially raped by an English aristocrat in the 1870s and Giles' ancestor, the book puts great emphasis nonetheless on Anna's condition of disadvantage in comparison to Giles. She's from a working class background, first generation academic. She refuses to comply with the upper class expectations that both Giles's family and her non-academic acquaintances in Oxford place on her, while at the same time struggling as an early career scholar and a mother, a primary caregiver, to carve a place of her own in an academia that is still sexist and traditional. Significantly, when she is eventually given a permanent post, thanks to this project on Eve and May Moberley, she calls it an institutional room of my own, thus inextricably linking the feminist struggle for intellectual and economic independence to the Gothic ghosts haunting the structural, medicalized, and gendered oppression that has kept centuries of women under the control of men and under the radar of history. Furthermore, the trope of childbirth, its medicalization, and the long road to women having control over their own bodies in life and death establishes a matrilineal genealogy across night waking, which stands in opposition to the patriarchal legacy that the Cassingham blood flowing through Eve's corpse, as well as obviously Giles and his sons, represents. Where in Night Waking, Eve dies as a young baby and her mother is bound to a life at the margins of modernity, May, in Bodies of Light, after having failed at her task of trying to save the babies, including Eve, dies in a storm while seeking to cross back to the Scottish mainland, thus creating another layer of Gothic hauntings on the shores. At the same time, in Signs for Lost Children, her sister Ali, a pioneering medical student, safely delivers a baby in the impoverished quarters of working-class Manchester, thus marking the difference between the urban and rural poor and between an enthusiastic but unfocused nurse and a serious, less idealistic doctor, and again, putting an emphasis on the difference of care between a more structural system put in place by a professional as opposed to the informal care that the women in Colsay received before May arrived. As for Anna, she has an abortion relatively soon after birth to her son, so as to mark her ability to make safe, independent choices around her physical and mental health and around her desires and abilities pertaining to reproductive choices. These three examples show not only how feminism and a National Health Service have produced the watershed change in terms of women's health of the past 100 years or so, but also how, depending on context, the struggles related to childbirth, antenatal and natal care, and family planning are a cyclical return present across Moss's trilogy, marking another Gothic presence with a difference, as maintained by Wolfrey. In this respect, I would argue that Anna's story, Eve's story, and the stories of the two Moberley sisters, crossing 3 centuries and 3 novels, constitute not only a cluster of Gothic hauntings, but also a neo-Victorian exploration of women's struggles, literally torn between the distress and complications of childbearing, independent career ambitions, and the weight of historical oppression. According to Marie-Louise Kolke and Christian Gutleben, who wrote Neo-Victorian Gothic, edited rather, Horror, Violence, and the Generation in the Reimagined 19th Century. After the end of history, history appeared to be coming back with a vengeance, the emphasis is mine. The ghost of the past is questioned, made visible, and even foregrounded, so as to Gothically suggest that the bygone is never bygone, and that the whole point of postmodernist art is to problematize the pastness of the past and the deadness of the dead. As Anna's story proves, the dead are never dead as long as there are texts testifying about their existence, and this is obviously her role and her passion and her purpose as a historian who is compelled to produce research and uncover those dead legacies, regardless of the ghosts that they might bring back to haunt the present. Finally, the haunting connection between May's letters written in 1878 and found by Anna in the early years of the millennium in night waking, and May's death by drowning in bodies of light is another Colsay resurfacing. It becomes a literary revenant, a neo-Victorian, and again I'm using the words by Colsay and Gottlieb, an uncanny doppelganger that allows Moss to bring the layers of historiography, the history of medicine, and literary fantasy together. Where in Night Waking, Moss used the contemporary frame of the history scholar who, by uncovering May's correspondence and the corpse, finds an answer to the qualms of her own marriage, experience of motherhood, and equally important, her own professional standing. In Bodies of Light, she recreates the Moberley's story without the intermediary mediumistic role of the contemporary setting, thus giving the Gothic another possibility, but taking away the possibility of the haunting, the revenant in the first book. If, as argued by Katie Shaw, hauntology is driven by narrative agency as the primary motivating force of the return, end of quote, in her neo-Victorian Colsay Gothic tales, Sarah Moss expands the potential of such narrative agency by layering different strata of haunting. Indeed, her protagonist's act of researching is a form of almost Derridean, parasitical overstepping the boundaries of the hospitality of the possibilities of texts past. Moss's own act of writing and ultimately the reader's encounter with the ghosts of the text all intersect with one another and make of these texts live ghosts to be reckoned with just as much at least as the live ghosts evoked by the finding of corpses and dead birds in the attic. Thank you very much for listening to me. These are my contacts. I look forward to discussing my paper and your papers in the next couple of days, and this is the bibliography that I use.